Uh, because bankers consider communism and dictatorship as a good investment. A banker considers a dictatorship as a perfect government because everybody is totally controlled, and if anybody objects to paying high taxes or to paying debts, you can put them in a concentration camp or execute them, which Stalin did in Russia, and which is the perfect system. No banker will ever tell you this. Well, David Rockefeller did during the 1940s. He said the reason he was so pro-communist at that time was because the communists collected their debts at the point of a gun, which he didn't say, but that's why they do it. And that is why dictatorship remains the ideal of all bankers.
What is the main mission of the Federal Reserve System today?
Well, my book, The World Order, goes into that quite extensively, which unfortunately is out of print. But I found out when I wrote that book that the main mission of the banks was to start wars. And I found out also that it's very difficult to start a war. If you want to start a war with Iraq, go out and try to do it. It's very tough. And it takes years of hard work. So Bush had a great advantage because his father was head of the Central Intelligence Agency and a worldwide drug distribution operation. So he had plenty of money and plenty of political influence. He had no problem at all to walk into Iraq, although Iraq had never fired a shot at the United States. You see, you declare war on another country when they invade your country and try to take your territory, or there has to be some very good reason to have a war, because you can understand that it's very difficult to get millions of people to run out and kill each other when they have absolutely no bone of contention whatsoever. In fact, all the wars have had... See, that's why Ezra got into this entire thing, and that's how he got me into it. He was living in Paris during World War I, and he had many young writers and artist friends who were drafted into the armies, and some were for Germany and some were for France, and they were killed. And he couldn't understand how these great talents, very brilliant young men, died for nothing. And when he spent years of studying the situation in 8 languages all over Europe, he found out that bankers make wars to create debt. And that's the only reason. And that's the only reason. We went to war against Germany in World War I and World War II at a time when by census, 52% of the population of the United States was of German origin. So this was like a civil war. The bankers, the central banks of Europe, and they couldn't have World War I. They'd been wanting World War I since 1885. But the central banks of Europe had already bankrupted every country in Europe. And it was impossible to have a war. They didn't have enough money. There wasn't a country in Europe, England, France, Germany, Russia. There wasn't a country in Europe which could finance one day's war anywhere. So that's why they were conspiring in the United States to get the Federal Reserve System passed, because the Federal Reserve System was conjured up simply to make World War I possible. Without the Federal Reserve, there would never have been a World War I. No American would ever have died in World War I. So you can say they were murdered by the bankers, because that was the only reason they were there.
So you say that they don't start the war, but they conspire to make it happen? I mean,
they make it happen, yes.
How do they do that? I mean,
well, they do that through worldwide conspiracies, through Masonic and other secret brotherhoods all over the world, which operate as criminal conspiracies. The Mafia, the Masons, and the Jesuits, and so forth. There are always these underground groups which are very profitable. When you get into one of those things, you get into very profitable situations. And when you're in one of these organizations, you become very wealthy yourself. Al Capone became one of the richest people in the United States. And he complained to the newspaper men. He said, "I'm just like any other businessman." And he was. All businessmen were like him, but they wouldn't admit it.
Is the United States government a corporate, banking, criminal enterprise?
Well, it's a conglomerate of various criminal enterprises. There are many criminal enterprises in the United States. Some are quite large and some are quite small.
Is the government a criminal enterprise?
Always a criminal enterprise, because the elections are completely staged and manipulated from the beginning to the end. The candidates are chosen through a very careful process of someone who will thoroughly agree with anything they want to do, foreign policy and economic policy. There are two ways you govern a country, and that's through economic policy and foreign policy. Because as far as a country itself, it's a limited operation. The United States is limited to the borders of this country.
Is the U.S. monetary system controlled by the Bank of England?
Oh, yes, it is. I say that in my book. The subtitle of my book, Secrets of the Federal Reserve, is The London Connection, in which I prove conclusively that London still runs the United States. See, London is still the world market of the world bankers. Not Washington, not New York, and not Tokyo, and not Berlin, but it's London. George Bush went public after I published this book. It had been published for about almost a year, and I'd sold maybe 100 copies because I never advertised my books. They were never reviewed. Nobody paid attention to it. And George Bush Sr. was president at that time, and in November of whatever year it was, he started going on the television and talking about the New World Order. And of course, the only book on the World Order is my book. So I sold out immediately, which was very disconcerting because I have no publishing company, and I had to go and print another edition. And so it's out of print again right now. But people are begging for copies. In fact, they sell copies on the internet for very large sums because it's the only book.
What is the World Order?
The World Order is a conglomeration of people who agree on the same goals, and they run the world.
So it's a conspiracy of
bankers and politicians and political leaders, and it's mostly it's what is loosely known as capitalists. And a capitalist is not a person who makes capital, he's a person that has capital, and he can make investments. That's what a capitalist is. And he makes investments that make money, more money. And that's all capitalism is. You invest in things that make more money than you have already. So when H.L. Hunt was the richest man in the world, he was buying whole radio networks. In fact, I helped him set up a television network. And he was going to have his own television network. At that time, there were still 3 networks. And he was going to set up a 4th because he had so much money that there was no problem for him at all to set up a television network. And it's a good thing for him he didn't do it because he would have been murdered if he had started his own television network. He wouldn't have lived 6 months because that is real power. They didn't care how much money he made, that he was the richest man in the world, but it's when you take over the levers of power that you become dangerous. And when he had his own television network, he could have ruled the whole world. So he would have been killed, there's no question about it.
Why is it that people don't seem to care?
Well, in the 1930s, scientists wondered how Hitler could rule Germany and Stalin could rule Russia. These were vast territories. He could rule them with practically no army. And the answer was they had discovered during the 1920s that adding sodium fluoride to the drinking water made the people very passive. Stalin found out that in his concentration camps, where you have to have guards, I mean nobody's there because they want to be, that by adding sodium fluoride to the drinking water to camps, or the gulags, he could reduce his guards by an average of 4. You only need 1 in 4, 25% instead of 100%, which comes to quite a bit of money. Sodium fluoride is a byproduct of the manufacture of aluminum, which is a very complicated, well, you have it in Florida. It's a very complicated manufacturing process, and a byproduct of the manufacture of aluminum is sodium fluoride, which is a very dangerous chemical and is very expensive to dispose of. So somebody came up with the imaginative premise that maybe sodium fluoride could be used to add to water, and maybe it would help prevent cavities in children in their teeth. There was never any study conducted on this, and no proof whatsoever that this was true, but Congress, with the judicious application of bribes, passed a bill enacting sodium fluoride addition to water supplies all over the United States. And we haven't had a revolution since. And we had one-party government ever since.
Why did America get involved in World War II?
Well, it was inevitable because World War II was simply a rerun of World War I, exactly the same cast of characters. And in fact, it was the same person, Colonel Mandel House, whose father was a Rothschild agent during the Civil War. And the senior House managed to have runners, privateers, bring cotton from the South to the British mills so that they could operate during the Civil War. So he made a lot of money, of course. And at the end of the Civil War, Colonel House was the only person in the state of Texas who had any money. So he took over the entire Democratic Party in the southern states, which were occupied territory, and still are. You still have two political parties in the South. They're called the Carpetbaggers and the Scalawags. The Carpetbaggers are the Republicans, and the Scalawags are the Democrats. And you have exactly the same government that you have had in martial law in 1865, with the same people running everything. It's a perfect setup because everybody knows each other, everybody agrees with each other. There hasn't been a political contest in any southern state since 1865.
Is there a difference between carpetbaggers and scallywags?
Well, there is a difference. The difference is in the name. One group calls themselves Republicans, and the other calls Democrats. The Republicans are not Republicans, and the Democrats are not Democrats. As I say, they're carpetbaggers and scalawags, but they're not known. The press doesn't use those terms because it's offensive to some people. Some people would be offended by that.
Was the United States ever really a true republic?
I don't know that we were. I really do not. Because the people who rewrote the... we started off with the Articles of Confederation. See, that's where the Confederacy comes from. Because when the southern states seceded from the Union, they were exercising the prerogative which they had been given during the Articles of Confederation to secede at any time. You see, the Articles of Confederation gave every state complete autonomy over its own power, over its own people. And so the southern states in 1860 decided to secede from the Union, which they had a perfect right to do. But in 1787, they rewrote the Articles of Confederation, and it was actually a secret convention of Masons in Philadelphia, and they rewrote the Constitution to create a federal government, mainly for the borrowing power. The bankers wanted a country which could have a borrowing power and which could pay back the money, and that was not possible under the Articles of Confederation. The United States colonies, when they won the American Revolution, they set up a governing